Sarika Devan from UNODC Inehi Center of Excellence, and I'm here today with Michael Levi, who has been a professor of criminology at Cardiff University since 1991. Thank you very much for joining us today.
It's a great pleasure and an honor.
I will be asking you a couple of questions on cybercrime today. I know that you have done extensive research on fraud, money laundering, organized crime, and more recently, cybercrime.
That's correct. Yeah.
So the challenges in classifying the different types of cybercrime have been thoroughly discussed. But in your experience, what would be the main types of cybercrime?
Well, probably one of the more useful ways of thinking about it is to think about cyber-dependent crime, which means crime that couldn't happen without the internet. Cyber-enabled crime, which means crime that is assisted a lot by the internet, and just generally cyber-assisted crime. Most of us these days have mobile phones, often smartphones, and those have become part of everyday life, and they can help crime, and sometimes, of course, they can help the police.
And what would you say are the best approaches to measure cyber-related crimes?
Well, I think if we used to think about, one of the key questions we need to ask ourselves is, why are we doing this measurement? And are we trying to find out, for example, about whether cybercrime is being more profit motivated than it used to be? Are we trying to find out if some foreign power, for example, Russia or China or the US, is trying to get at us in some way as part of a power drive? There are lots of different kinds of questions that we might ask, and all of them have different measures. But let's assume that a lot of crime is more profit motivated as opposed to political power or fun motivated than it used to be. So one of the questions we might ask is how much it costs. And for that you need to measure how much the different kinds of victims lose from cybercrime. And that would require you to look at individuals, corporations, large and small, governments, and how much they pay out. And that's got two dimensions. The first dimension is how much money or goods they actually lose. For example, if people are ordering goods by credit card from a distance, what is the value of those goods if they are ripping off the supplier? An alternative way of thinking about it is how much money do they spend on protecting themselves against cybercrime, or how much they spend in responding. One of the things that is happening more and more, for example, is ransomware, where you click on something that you think you want to follow through the email, and you suddenly find your computer is locked, and they then demand money from you in order to release your computer so that you can finish your UN report or carry on transacting business. And that kind of ransomware is, in order to assess that, you need to know how much do people pay out. So one approach that traditionally has been used to measure crime has been just to look at crime statistics. But a lot of people don't report stuff to the police because they don't think the police are going to be able to do anything for them. And if you're not insured, well, why bother reporting? So you have to use more and more variety of sources. For example, the banks have information about losses from credit cards. So how do you get the information from the banks? The British authorities have been particularly good at that kind of thing. Another kind of thing might be, how much do people spend on cybersecurity? Well, that could be just the software that you put on from the big companies to try and protect yourself from viruses. So you could collect information about that, and you can get information about patterns of viruses from the big firms themselves rather than from the police. So the costs of cybercrime has a lot of different components to it. Another thing you might be interested in is, what impact has it had on you? You know, if all of your business was frozen because that's what the hackers have done to you, then how much money did you lose from that? You might be able to get that from an insurance company, or you may have to get it from the business itself. So you need to use multiple sources to get that kind of information. And if what you want is to find out how badly you were affected, you might ask people, you know, how afraid were you? You know, what impact did it have on how you went about your business, what you bought, whether you went into shops more as a result, whether you were too afraid to shop on the internet, and did you pay more for your goods as a result? So there's a range of different kinds of questions to do with people's feelings of security and to do with the harms, both objective harms and people's feeling of harm, that you can approach in different ways. There's also the issue for the police. You know, how do the police respond to these threats? What happens in some countries is they try and centralize all the reporting of cyber crimes, either to the police or to a non-police body that can collect information. If companies are being hacked, they may want to report it to a crime prevention body rather than the police, because they know not much investigation is going to happen, particularly if the offender is somewhere overseas in a place that is too expensive or legally difficult to get to. And therefore that may lead to a different approach, a focus on prevention rather than on legal pursuit.
And just following up on the police recorded data, what do you think countries or organizations could do to collect better data on cybercrime?
Well, one of the things that the police can do to get better data on cybercrime is to talk to businesses and individuals more about them. Instead of waiting for them to make reports, they have to kind of do more outreach and to give people the confidence that the cybercrimes they are suffering is something the police care about and are willing to do something about. Now, what they're willing and what they're able to do about may vary. You know, if I'm in the UK and, say, a hacker is in Russia, it's not very likely that the police are going to be able to get assistance from Russia to deal with that, particularly if it's a small thing. But for example, the Bank of Bangladesh was hacked for many millions, and they had a lot of support from different countries as well as from Europol and Interpol in trying to recover the money and chase after the attackers. So it depends on the kind of thing that it is. Europol and Interpol have responded quite well to these big attacks because they affect national security. They don't want criminals to think they can get away with these really big crimes. But a small local one that affects just a few individuals, they're not going to, in practice, pour a lot of resources into going after that. And that is one of the big challenges that cybercrime poses. I mean, fraud that is offline also poses a lot of problems, but cybercrimes have become so routine that chasing after offenders in every case is just not realistic.
Absolutely. So, moving from the data collection to, let's say, the victims of cyber attacks, is it possible to say what the most vulnerable population segments are of cyber attacks?
Well, vulnerability is a very interesting question. I think most people are vulnerable to some cyber attacks. And the data has been showing that a larger and larger percentage of people try to attack. Some of that can be dealt with by buying antivirus equipment, but people also have to train themselves not to click on hyperlinks of emails that look plausible, or somebody is offering them the chance to some prize that they have never actually entered into, or they find or they're expecting to click and find pictures of beautiful women or underage children. They need to discipline themselves not to do that kind of thing, because they may find that their computer has been infected, or they might find themselves being blackmailed by somebody. And so the level of kind of romance scams and blackmail is one of the areas that I'm doing a project with colleagues to look into how we can better protect people. But most people who have computers, and that's most of the population in many countries, are vulnerable. And surprisingly, we've found that chief executives are often very vulnerable, because once they get an email, they think that it must be authorized and click on it. And because they have access to so much of the corporate affairs, then a lot more data gets compromised that way. So one of the things cybercrime should try and force us to do, whether we're a business or an individual, is to think a lot more before we react to stuff that is in front of us. And companies have to learn to take much better care of our data than they have done in the past. So the demographics of vulnerability are quite complicated, and they're not often what you would expect. Old people maybe are more cautious in some ways of doing things on the internet, but they're also more trusting.
Yeah, absolutely.
And as one fraudster I interviewed expressed it, do your friends first, they're easier.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your time, and I wish you all the best for the rest of the conference.